John Nix, welcome to the Singing Teachers Talk podcast. How is Texas treating you?
It's very hot here still. Summer lasts from about mid-March to about October, so it's very hot. Still highs in 95 to 100 Fahrenheit. So, yeah.
Wow, yeah, too hot. You know, whenever I read the word Texas, I automatically get hungry.
Well, we do have some good food. I mean, the blend of this part of Texas where I live, San Antonio, you have this blend of obviously, the Mexican influence. And then you also have a lot of this area was settled also by people from Germany and Czechoslovakia. And so you have this interesting mix of food, and even some of the towns, you'll still see, well, there's a town that if you pronounced it in the German way, it would be Berne, but they say Bernie in Texas. So yeah, it's an interesting cultural mix here for sure.
Yeah. Oh, I need it. I need to get my barbecue sauce on and get the ribs out. That'd have been a good little snack for us for this really juicy discussion, I think, on the topic of vibrato.
A very nice transition. I like that.
Thank you. Segued right in there. Compared to the other areas of voice, how much research is there for us to read on the topic of vibrato?
Well, I mean, the study of vibrato, there's the Carl Seashore study from, it's now about close to 100 years ago. That's kind of the landmark first scientific investigation. Compared to other aspects of singing, I would say there's a nice amount, but not an overwhelming amount of research in vibrato. And some of that has to do with, we now have tools where we can measure it, and we can measure not only, kind of steady state vibrato, but changes in vibrato pretty well. A program like Voce Vista Video Pro, you can literally go in and you can be looking at the rate of the change of the vibrato over time, and obviously extract all sorts of information about it. It used to have to be done very painstaking, where they would, basically print out a spectrogram and count how many, frequency oscillations occurred in a particular time. And so it was very tedious to do it up until, I think some of our more modern computing in the, late 1980s, early 1990s, and then it became much easier.
Why else do you think vibrato doesn't have as much research compared to other areas of voice?
That's a good question. Certainly vibrato is part of Western classical singing and some other genres around the world, but it's not, part and parcel of all vocal genres. And so I think that may be part of it. I don't know. Good question. I'll have to come back to that a little bit.
Considering what we do know then, how can we define what vibrato is?
It's a periodic oscillation of fundamental frequency, which we perceive as pitch, and then all of the harmonics of that. It's also an oscillation of amplitude, so, apparent intensity or volume. And we might not maybe pick up on that overtly, but we might notice that there's we kind of perceive a little fluttery quality or something along with the vibrato, and that's literally we're picking up on that subtle amplitude change. It's also of, oscillation of timbre, because harmonics are sweeping through where those vowel resonances are, so they're kind of going in and out, of those vowel resonances. The subglottic pressure is oscillating. How much the closed quotient, how much of each vibration cycle of the vocal folds, how long are they in contact? That varies some. There's even some, you can do an endoscopy on somebody and notice that the pharyngeal walls and stuff are kind of oscillating. And if that's the case, then their vocal tract resonances are subtly changing as well. So I even wrote an article, I did a presentation. It's called, a whole lot of shaking going on. And it's all about, the whole system oscillates, and this is just one aspect of it that is very apparent to us in hearing somebody sing.
So, along with those oscillations in the system, what else anatomically might be happening to produce it?
Well, we know for sure that the activity of the cricothyroid muscle is highly correlated, and that only makes sense because that's a muscle that's affecting vocal fold length. So we know those two things are very, very highly correlated with each other, that there's the firing of the cricothyroid muscle. There's, also, Ingo Titze has written an article, it's about the reflex resonance model about vibrato, and, there's neurologic tremors that are going on that we are kind of in training to a aesthetically desirable rate. And I know, we may kind of talk about that in a couple of minutes. But, nothing in our body is still. There are fluctuations in our respiratory system as well. It's interesting you bring this up, because the other day in my vocal pedagogy class with my graduate students, we were doing a voice range profile, and we were doing, when they were singing at a very low dynamic level, fairly low in their range, and one of them, I picked up on it immediately. They were singing right at kind of their phonation threshold, and you could start to hear this. And they're like, "What is that?" I said, "That's your heart rate imprinting on your," and they're like, "No way." And then another person got up and was in the same, kind of zone, and they were singing very, very softly. I said, "Well, doesn't it make sense? Your carotid arteries are running on either side there, So anyway, there's a lot of things that go into it.
What other terminology might we encounter when we're reading about vibrato or talking about vibrato, and especially the terms rate, extent, and jitter? Can you just explain also what they mean?
So vibrato rate, and particularly these are used in talking about the frequency of vibrato. So vibrato rate would be, literally how many times per second the frequency cycles up and down and up and down. And so from, if we kind of say, okay, here's the average pitch, one complete cycle from here's the average, it swings up, it swings down, and it comes back up to that midpoint. So that would be one cycle. So how many of those cycles in 1 second is the vibrato rate? And then how far above and below, that average pitch is the frequency swinging, and we call that extent. So rate is typically, you'll see in the literature, 5 hertz. So that would be 5 times a second. And then extent, oftentimes, some papers you'll read, it'll be talking about in percentage, but very often we use cents, C-E-N-T-S. So there's 100 cents in a semitone, in a half step. And so you'll see the vibrato extent being measured in cents. And you wouldn't use hertz, number one, because that's confusing with rate. And also, a semitone there and a semitone are going to be a whole, you go up an octave, we're doubling frequency. And so, a semitone there is a lot more hertz change than an octave below. But if we use cents, we're able to compare vibrato at all sorts of different pitches. Vibrato jitter, on the other hand, is looking at the regularity of the period of each vibrato cycle. So we have, down, up, down, and back. So that's one vibrato cycle, and the amount of time it takes to go through that, we'd call that the period of the vibrato. And then how regular that period is the jitter. And you can think of it as a consistency in the rate. It's basically a measure of the consistency of the rate of the vibrato. Typically in good, say, Western classical singing and genres that have vibrato in them, we want to see the desired rate for most people is between 5 and 6 hertz. You'll hear a little slower, a little faster than that, but generally that 5 to 6 range is the sweet spot. An extent of about plus or minus 50 cents, so about a quarter tone above and below. And then a jitter of about 3%. So we really, we like to hear, and there's, all sorts of studies that have been done on, and I've done a couple on, the desired, rate that people tend to find pleasing. I did a study where I had choral directors and singers and singing teachers come in, and we were just using the MADA software, which is a synthesis program, and sit them down, and I literally just adjusted it until they said, yes, that's the one I like. And what was very interesting is the choral directors liked a narrower extent than the singing teachers did. And everybody's preferences on rate were somewhat skewed by where I started, the starting point. But there have been other studies. And anyway, yeah, that we could prattle on about that a lot. But those are the three terms you see in the literature a lot.
Talking about that sweet spot, who decided that it was 5 hertz or around or between that 4 and 7 hertz range, and how has it evolved over time?
Sure. I don't know who decided. I mean, I think taste in that has changed. My good friend Joshua Glasner has done some research on, he was very interested in listening to these early recordings from, say, turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century, and you hear singers, and it seems like the vibrato is much faster than what is used now. And so he did some research on, well, is that just an artifact of how they were recorded or not? And his research is actually, no, though they actually did have faster vibrato rates, and that what we hear on those recordings is actually pretty reliable to what they were doing. So obviously fashion has changed over time. Why has it changed? There have been some theories about that. Performance spaces have gotten larger. There are more big performance spaces. Orchestras, the quality of orchestras has continued to improve. And, that may be affecting how people are singing, that they're going for a little greater amplitude. And as such, that might make the vibrato a little slower and wider. There's a lot of theories about, why is that the case? Maybe people's taste has changed due to the ease of people being able to travel. We don't have people in southern Italy, this has kind of been desirable, and people in France, this has kind of been desirable, because people travel all over the world now, and they're able to hear singers all over the world. And, so maybe it's just a function of the fact that the aesthetic is kind of more international than regional.
And if that vibrato has somewhat slowed then over time, has that been a conscious decision of the singer, or is it something that has evolved naturally, for want of a better word?
Yeah, I don't think there's any conscious aspect to it at all. I think, most likely it's, probably being driven by people's taste. They like a particular tonal quality, a particular aesthetic, and with that comes then some very subtle changes in vibrato, and those people get hired and they're heard more. And, that's a very interesting, I think, not only is, say, voice pedagogy, voice science question, but a musicological question and a perceptual question. So psychoacoustics, why do people's preferences, why have they changed over time?
If it is slowing, then will there be a day where we see vibrato disappear completely?
I would say no, because if you think about, well, why is the vibrato there? If you hear people, like, say you pick up the phone and it's a friend of yours, and you hear in their voice that they're upset, and one of the things, or very emotional about something, and one of the ways in which heightened emotion imprints itself upon our voice, is that there's a tremulousness to it, and we just had the anniversary here in the U.S. of the famous Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, and you hear him speaking, and sometimes with very emotive speech, you will hear, that oscillation in amplitude and in frequency. So I think, there are aspects of vibrato that are very much tied to emotion, and that's a reflection of our neurologic state, and then that would be imprinted on our voice. So I don't think it's ever going to go away. I could be wrong, but I think that's an aspect of human communication that, again, because it's so linked to emotion, and emotion is so linked to neuromuscular stuff reflected in our body. So I think it's here to stay. It tastes change all the time. So
That was me earlier, by the way. I was on the phone to the car dealers and I got a new car recently and it's all gone completely tits up, as we say here. And I had to put my assertive voice on and I was saying, I'm not very happy. I could feel my voice
uh-huh.
shaking with that. So yeah, I could totally relate on that one today. And I hope it doesn't disappear. It's one of my favorite things ever in
Well, and you
voice.
even hear, there are pop recordings that you hear that they are manipulating and creating, I will hear that done and I go, okay, I listen to vibrato all the time. I hear singers all the time. That's a studio electronic thing that they are doing. That is not someone's natural vibrato, and it's occurring on the same note, on the same text, that they're they're actually making it happen with, the magic of computer software. And so you have to think, okay, there's something about that. Which, going down the rabbit hole just a little bit, I have a colleague here in our linguistics department, and we've done some studies on what does vocal fry mean, particularly in popular styles, and we're getting the wheels turning on, well, what does vibrato mean? What does it, what is the connotation of vibrato in singing styles, and we'll probably have a variety of genres. Anyway, we're cooking on the ideas on that because she's very, very interested in her father is in music and she's in linguistics and in Latin American languages, but she also has a big interest in singing and pop music and so on. And I'm very interested in vibrato. So it's like a marriage made in heaven. We love bouncing ideas off of each other. And that's kind of our next one that we're going after is I've been doing a lot of study of, okay, what, like looking at college voice majors. Okay, what is their average rate and extent and different vowels and so on. But to go in and take this thing that I've been passionate about for years and, well, why do people do it? And having people listen to recordings, that are identical except with and without vibrato, and say, and not even having them really aware that the question we're asking is about what does the vibrato mean, but just say, you hear this person, does that make them more confident, less confident, more genuine, less genuine? Kind of finding, well, what are the social correlates of this vibrato? What is it communicating?
So, why do we use it then? What's it offering us both from a technical standpoint and from the audience perception as well?
Sure. I think certainly in a number of styles, we would think when we hear vibrato, there's heightened emotion involved. And, in terms of what does it do for a singer? I mean, there are some studies. It was John Large and, gosh, what is it? Shigeru, I think, Iwata. They were looking at vibrato and non-vibrato, and they found that airflow rates were higher with vibrato. Now, there's been some other studies that have said, maybe that's not so much the case. At any rate, for me as a singing teacher, when I am working with students and I hear the vibrato becoming more regular, more stable, and that the extent is not too wide, that the rate is not too slow or too fast, that tells me that their system is coming into better balance, in terms of the amount of breath pressure that they're using, the airflow while they sing, that things in terms of their shaping, their vocal tract tuning, and so on, that all of that is starting to sync up in a better way. When the vibrato draws attention to itself, that, that's one of those cues I use as a teacher. I go, okay, we just went, from this note to that note, or this vowel to that vowel, and the vibrato changed. And that's when I put on my calm voice and I go, hey, could you do that one more time? And I listen to it, and I'm really trying to parse out, oh, okay, the vowel was a little too closed, and that affected their breath pressure, or etc. I'm using that as a real bellwether of that the production is easier. And when I hear something change, then, and it draws my attention, I go, what's happened here? Why did I suddenly notice that change in the vibrato extent or rate or regularity?
And there are some different types of vibrato that we might come across as well. So we might read of abdominal versus laryngeal vibrato. Can you just explain what those two mean? And is there a preference that we should be aiming towards?
The respiratory oriented vibrato, I can literally, I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to pulse my abdominal wall. So I'm literally changing my breath pressure. And so you will see that respiratory mediated vibrato, and you'll see people kind of doing that, and it's a lot less efficient because, using subglottic pressure to change pitch, number one, it's typically a lot slower, accelerating and decelerating your viscera pressing against your lungs. That's not, we don't have near the fine control of it over things as we do at the laryngeal level. I think the laryngeal mediated vibrato is much more preferable. That, the micro muscles that literally it's their job to balance vocal fold tension and length and so on. That's what they do, the cricothyroid and the thyroarytenoid muscle. And that balance between the two of them, that is one of their key functions. And so that is a whole lot more efficient for us than, pulsing the respiratory system. So, yeah, you will see that. And in fact, I have a few cheat sheets here. Hold on. Yes, okay, this is Thomas Shipp and some colleagues back in 90. I'll just read the quote. Vibrato can be separated into two principal classes of production. The first relies on rhythmic pulsations in subglottal air pressure produced by contractions of the abdominal muscles to modulate the fundamental frequency. And so the intrinsic laryngeal muscles maintain a steady contraction against which abdominally induced subglottic air pressure pulses act. And that's exactly what I did, thereby, pulsing my abdominal wall. And then the second type is the laryngally mediated one.
I'm just going to jump ahead to actually, because we're going to talk about how we instigate vibrato in somebody who doesn't have it currently, or maybe has never experienced that before. And something I've come across is like a pump at the sternum, or something that is creating some form of fluctuation for the singer to get in check with what that might feel like. Would you say that's a good exercise to do, or does that maybe play into that abdominal vibrato that we might not necessarily want?
Well, I'm thinking of, say, accent method, and I know, there's some prominent singing teachers, very fine teachers who I admire and respect, who use that in some of their singing instruction. They probably are using that more for the person to get some sense of kind of like what aspects of their physiology are involved in voice production, and maybe to get some better, I guess, connection or synchrony between what's going on respiratory wise to voice output. So, I understand that's a means to an end. What I like to do with people who are interested in having vibrato, because of stylistic things, or I as the teacher am feeling like, that might be a route for them to get some greater freedom, doing things where their voices, they're moving rapidly versus sustaining, so maybe a pattern where they're doing It's like a ah, so they're alternating a fast moving pattern and sustaining. And if we, can find the freedom on the moving pattern, then when they go to the sustaining, maintaining, continuing that freedom and see what emerges. I'm very much an advocate of help the person gain technical freedom and see if the vibrato emerges rather than overtly trying to make the vibrato happen. Because I think oftentimes people, I've done a lot of work with Alexander technique, and I think people end gain, they're like, okay, I'm going to get the vibrato, and they will manufacture it rather than allow it. And I think it's much more beneficial if we look at it as something that occurs when we gain a particular coordination and freedom than something that we make happen.
So then how do we know perceptually or ourselves if we're doing it whether the vibrato is fake versus real? I've come across that a couple of times.
Well, I certainly think, watching oneself in a mirror or on video, are you seeing other structures, tongue and jaw, looking at the neck, do you see other structures moving in a rather wild manner? That might be a good indication of, maybe that's not necessarily desirable. Maybe I'm, manufacturing something somehow. I think that's one thing. Certainly listening back, and getting a sense of effort. I think when vibrato is free, as there isn't a perception of effort in it happening, it's there. I don't have a sense. In fact, for me, after having, many years of Western classical training, singing without vibrato feels much more effortful than singing with vibrato. So, that's a long discussion in itself.
So when it comes to something like a heavier vibrato or a slow rate vibrato versus something that's faster, almost like a bleat, what's going on there? So let's just start with the slow version. If someone tends to have a heavier sounding, slower rate vibrato, what tends to be the culprit from your experience or intuition, and how might we be able to help them quicken it up a little bit?
Oftentimes, in addition to the slower vibrato rate, the production itself is heavier. So, you might hear that the subglottic pressure is high, and perhaps that the vowel timbre is on the darker side. I'm looking at, say, position of their tongue and things like that, how open their mouth is, because sometimes, they've gotten through, instruction of well-meaning teachers or in their own work, and they're literally a little too open and a little too dark for the pitch that they're trying to sing or the vowel that they're trying to sing. And that then puts, a little bit of a different acoustic load on the system. And, we hear the slower vibrato rate. And then, on the other extreme, the faster vibrato rate. Again, the subglottic pressure, transglottal airflow balance might be a little bit out of sync. Probably, again, the pressure could be too high. And in this case, sometimes the vowel being a little too closed is one of the things that I listen for very carefully. We did one small study, my former grad student of mine, Paul Patinka, and we did one on mouth opening. So like habitual mouth opening, and then a 1.5 centimeter mouth opening and a 4 centimeter mouth opening. And we were looking at how the vibrato changed. And this was just sopranos in their mid-range. That's in the Journal of Singing. Basically what we saw is when you take someone away from their habitual opening, that you get changes in their vibrato that are not always favorable in terms of, the keeping them in that sweet range. It didn't quite go the way we thought it was, but, we'd love to see maybe redoing that study with a larger sample and so on. And also looking at, we were talking earlier about the laryngeal mediated versus the respiratory one. using my observation in that regards, checking what do I see in the person's body in terms of their abdominal wall or chest wall movements, looking at their neck and different structures and how that syncs up or doesn't with what I'm hearing with the vibrato. Typically, I mean, this is painting with a very broad brush, a heavier production and probably too dark, to vowels too open, particularly the back vowels, ah, o, u, we would associate that with the slower vibrato, and, the faster kind of bleedy vibrato, vowels too closed, breath pressure too high, that kind of a thing. So, I mean, that's kind of, again, generalizing.
Gives us a good ballpark to.
Yeah, that's kind of the good ballpark, yeah, for
Mm,
troubleshooting.
mm. How successful are singers at changing the rate or extent of their vibrato?
It's very interesting. There was a study, and I've got it here in my cheat sheet. There's a study, King and Horry. They tested 9 singers and they found vibrato rate was easier to match than extent. And it was easier for people to target something slower than their natural rate versus faster. And there was also another study, Dromny was the lead author, found that sound pressure level decreased when female subjects matched a slower rate, and it increased in their head register when matching a faster rate. So that indicates maybe they're adjusting their breath pressure some in order to make some changes in the rate. Yeah, there have been some studies, where either you're listening to a synthesized tone and you're told to kind of, blend with, or they pair people together. So, I mean, people do that, and I think they're probably doing it with some subtle things with their breath pressure, probably. We have, again, if you look at Titze's work on the reflex resonance model, and that there's neurologic tremors that we kind of are in training, that there's everybody kind of has natural tremors in their body, and so you're going to have kind of the ballpark that you can play in, and you probably can't vary too much outside of that, unless your emotional state is very, very drastically changed. Certainly, and I'm kind of anticipating where we might go with this. Age is another thing, that it does slow with age, and why. I mean, nerve conduction velocities slow down with age, and muscles, the activation for muscles and contraction times and things slow down with age. So, the nerve sends an impulse to the muscle, say go, and it takes the muscle slightly longer to go to respond to that impulse. So those are things that are going on. Muscle deconditioning, use it or lose it, so if you, as I know, I mean, I'm 59 now, it's very important for me to practice every day, keep my voice, because if I take a couple of days off, it's like, oh gosh, have I ever done this in my life? That I used to get away with, my margin of error is smaller now, and I have to keep myself up regularly. There are a variety of things that weigh into what's going on as people age. There's chronologic age and there's physiologic age. Chronologic age is, well, what does the calendar tell me? I'm going to be 60 in December. But physiologic age is, my overall fitness and the regularity, and the quality of my practice and things like that. Hopefully I'm doing everything I can to keep myself as young as I possibly can be.
As long as you don't go down the route of, I can't remember his name. There's a gentleman who's going to the extremes of reversing his age from 45 to 18, doing some wonderful things, but sounds quite restrictive in terms of lifestyle. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, right, yeah. And I'm thinking of, what is it, the Portrait of Dorian Gray.
Yes, yes.
Anyway,
Yeah. So what about children then? Do children have access to vibrato as we are aiming for?
my good friend Ginevra Williams has been doing research, obviously, for years, and David Howard and Graham Welsh, all three in the UK, chronologic studies with people going through, some of the cathedral schools and so on, these longitudinal studies, and some of it is just maturation of some of the muscles that are involved. Certainly as we go through puberty, particularly with your tenor, baritone, bass voices that are under the influence of testosterone, the TA muscle bulks up quite a bit, and there's rapid growth and so on that's going on. And it's often around that time that we start hearing a noticeable vibrato, start to occur in people's voices. So I think there are some physiological maturation things that are going on. I've heard kids, 10, 11, 12 years old who were singing very freely and they had a very lovely vibrato, and I think it's just as I was saying, with before, as a teacher, I'm very much of the, if things are free and the vibrato emerges, great. But I'm not in the business of let's make it happen. I think as that young singer's voice frees up and matures, if the vibrato starts appearing, and they're usually going to go, what's going on with my voice? It's like, that's okay. That's going to happen, putting them at ease with that. Obviously, there is the, now that we have, I can get on YouTube and I can find 15 different singers, there's a tendency to want to emulate an adult sound. It's okay for people to sound 10 or 12 years old. That's okay. Have a wonderful 10 or 12-year-old voice. You have all your life to have a more mature voice. It's okay to sing with the voice you have now.
Yeah, be a kid. I mean, if I could, I'd go back and play with my Sylvanian families all day long. I love them so much.
Exactly. To have a lot less responsibilities. Sign me up.
Thank you. I'll meet you there.
Yes.
So everybody loves a vocal exercise. Can you take us through a couple of your favorite things to do to either help somebody kind of speed up, slow down, understand what it's like to have vibrato?
Sure. There's an article that I have. It's called Shaken Not Stirred, and it's in the Journal of Singing. And it has a whole slew of exercises in it, kind of breaking it down into, and again, the exercises are designed thinking about the muscles that are involved. And so wanting to engage those pitch changing muscles. And so, as I said before, doing some of the, where we're doing the rapid alternation. And you could do that just something like that, or you could do, so we did rapid alternation. You could also do little scale figures. I mean, if you look at a lot of the Baroque literature where you have a quick little running passage and then you sustain on a note for a while, those kind of things are wonderful for this. Also, there was some research by Eric Krama in Sweden, and he was finding that vibrato speeds up towards as we're about to stop phonating. And so doing some things where you're doing little bounced patterns, where you're doing little lifts, and pairing that up with sustaining, things like that, where you do the bounced and sustaining, the rapid alternation, the florid, alternating with sustaining, or the onset offset kind of things. There's one that I freely admit, I stole this from the late Orrin Brown, very fine voice teacher here in the United States. And so you've got a quick move, and then you sustain. So, and so, again, just trying to keep the freedom that you have on the fast moving stuff when you go to the sustained. And also I love pairing movement. So, having a person move around while they're singing, turning their head from side to side or doing some trunk twists so that their body is is active and engaged, but flexibly so. It's dynamic freedom. So pairing up some exercises like that, and you can find phrases in the literature, and by any means, jazz songs or scatting. My gosh, there's some great examples, of little riffs and figures that combine moving fast and sustaining on a note. So find stuff that helps you do that.
This might be a very strange and unrelated question, but what's the
Never stopped you
correlation?
before.
Yeah, very true. She might as well carry on. Is there a correlation between vibrato and the ability to riff? If it's all to do with like rapid passages, if someone is able to vibrato, are they more likely able to riff?
That's a good question. And I certainly have noticed that in my years of teaching, that the students who have great facility in doing fast moving passages often have very regular vibrato. So I think you're probably onto something. And if you think about it from the neuromuscular coordination, the ability to do fast moving patterns means your intrinsic muscles, the TA and CT balance is really, really good. And so it would only make sense then that another thing that involves that really good balance of the TA and the CT muscles, vibrato, would also be good.
Is there any impact on changing the rate on the change of extent? So if I change the rate of my vibrato, does it automatically impact the extent, or are they not really related in that way?
I wouldn't say automatically. I think often we do see that they, if rate speeds up, that the extent reduces some, but not, I wouldn't say automatically. That's a subject for another study.
Okay.
That's my tactful way of saying, I don't know.
I love it. I love it. Okay. Yeah, we'll bypass that one then.
Yeah, good. That one gets edited out later, right?
Sure, sure. You can pay me on that one.
Yeah.
I've actually stolen this question from a brilliant mind of a colleague that I have because I think it's a really great question, which is if singing hadn't existed before today and we just woke up and automatically started to sing, would vibrato still be a feature? In other words, is it inevitable in singing?
Well, let me circle back to that idea of emotion, and I think one of the ways in which our voice responds to heightened emotion, which of course affects our whole body, is that it gets a tremulousness to it. If you think about, say you're walking across the street and, and vroom, you almost get hit by a car, you jump out of the way and, you're over on the sidewalk on the other side of the street, your heart is pounding, and you're just like, oh, your whole body is like trembling and so on. There are tremors in our body, and certainly vibrato is a tremor that we have entrained into our voices and we find aesthetically pleasing for a variety of reasons. So I think just as emotion imprints itself on so many aspects of our being, it would imprint itself on our voice, and I think it would emerge, eventually. Yeah.
So, in that sense, then, if somebody has optimal technical foundations, if everything kind of is in balance, as much as, we know that the voice is a moving target and we have to cope with all the external factors as well, are there ever going to be voices that just cannot access and just won't access vibrato?
Perhaps. In terms of cannot, I'm thinking about the cricothyroid, the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage, and they're rocking back and forth. That would have to be extremely narrow. That's a question to ask Ingo Titze, probably.
Okay, get him on the blower. We'll
Yeah. Well,
him.
he's on my speed dial. I would say get Johan Sundberg and Ingo Titze together and ask him that question. I've encountered some people that have had, I would say, greater difficulty finding that freedom of coordination. But there are certainly people who sing very freely who have minimal vibrato. I mean, there's always fluctuation in our voice. I mean, to eliminate all fluctuation, we can't do that. Muscles just don't fire that way. They're always turning on and turning off, and there's always this background little bit of stuff going on. So there's always going to be some variation there, and I think it's a matter of, does it rise to the perceptual threshold of, oh, I hear that as vibrato. My former grad student Randy Wooding and I did a study, and we were looking at kind of the vibrato extent, where people said, is there a threshold in the extent where people say, okay, yes, I hear vibrato there. And we did find it was like, it's like plus or minus like 13, 14. So it's like 27 cents plus, total. So 13, 14 plus or minus, which is very, very narrow. That's 1/10 of a semitone. So that's a pretty narrow fluctuation.
What do you want to know about vibrato? What's your kind of top priority burning question that you want to solve?
Well, what it means. And I think it'll be very interesting, this work that I'm doing with my colleague in linguistics, to look at it. I mean, obviously for research purposes, first we're going to look at people who are native speakers of English listening to people singing in English. But then it would be very interesting to then look at other cultures. Does vibrato mean the same thing in all cultures? Maybe not. So I think that would be some really fascinating. Why is it that in some styles and in some cultures it's been desirable and in others it's not? What does it mean in one versus what does it mean in another? So I think that's because that would then drive why do people learn different coordinations of their vocal mechanism. So that would be really, really fascinating. And then my colleague Josh Glasner and I have been doing some research on training people how to discriminate. Is that a change in rate, or is it a change in extent, or is it a change in both? And being able to hear things discriminate well when you've changed pitch, or you've changed vowel, or you've done both. So how do we best train people to listen in with that very keen listening, which is going to make them better teachers ultimately?
It's been fascinating. Thank you so much, John. Can you tell us where we can keep following your work and where we can get in touch with you to see how that's all going?
Sure. I have a website, and it's all run together, johnnixvoiceteacher.com. And that's got information about me and my teaching philosophy. And I've got, listing of all my articles and things. So johnnixvoiceteacher.com. And then my email is just John, John, and then a dot, Nix at utsa.edu, at UT San Antonio. So that's my university email, and I check it more times a day than I care to admit. And I'd love to hear from people. I love hearing, what people are interested in and what they're studying. And, I've been fascinated by vibrato since I was, first being trained as an undergraduate. So it's kind of a fascination.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, John Nix. It's been so great to spend some time with you today. And thank you for giving me your company.
Oh, it's been a real treat.